From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
It's good to be Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, at least if you believe the polls. The latest numbers show most Commonwealth residents have a favorable view of the Republican governor, and Baker has a commanding lead over his lesser-known Democratic challengers. But it's not all roses for Baker, who gets poor marks on how voters feel he's doing managing the state's roads and bridges, the MBTA, and the high cost of housing. This week, we focus on Massachusetts politics with a political roundtable on Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on this political roundtable this week from WPRI.com, reporter Ted Nesi. We also welcome back Lauren Dzenski from Politico, Massachusetts. And to my left, we have Gin Dumchis from Mass Live and Will Richmond from the Fall River Herald News. Everybody, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us. We tend to talk a lot of Rhode Island politics on this show, but a lot of our viewers live in Massachusetts, so it's good to have a bunch of experts here to dive into that. And let's start with Governor Baker. Lauren, I'm going to start with you. I referenced the poll in the open there. Just to get down to the numbers, he has a 66% favorability rating, something we're not used to here in Rhode Island. And against all his Democratic challengers, he's at about 60% reelect on that. What do his challengers see as a possible path to victory here against Charlie Baker?
So it's increasingly looking more and more difficult for the Democrats to dislodge Baker. He's the nation's most popular governor. His poll ratings, or his approval ratings, have remained high basically, throughout his time in his first term as governor. Democrats see the results of this most recent poll as kind of an example of ways to chip away. The things that were mentioned earlier in terms of housing costs, transportation, infrastructure, things like that. Those are ways to kind of create a wedge between the electorate and Governor Baker. But for these Democrats, they're also struggling to even have their names be known with voters. So if voters don't necessarily know who they are, they're having an increasingly hard time to kind of make that case.
Is there a standout Democrat right now among his challengers? Who is the person who's favored to get through the primary right now? What name are we going to see rise to the top?
I mean, there's not necessarily a standout name. There's three candidates: Bob Massey, Seti Warren, and Jay Gonzalez. Jay Gonzalez is an interesting kind of Democratic Charlie Baker. He has a lot of the same credentials in terms of state government and private sector experience. But Seti Warren is the former mayor of Newton and has a pretty positive, high profile, and at least in terms of some Democrats. And he has he's really kind of courted a Democratic base and has tried to kind of make a case for himself. Bob Massey, though, is interesting because he's very Bernie Sanders-esque, and he speaks to this progressive base in Massachusetts that's interested in seeing this change coming from the corner office. So he's also someone to watch as well. So long story short, there's still a lot of churn going on, and no one is necessarily breaking through.
Remind us, will they be winnowed in the convention? How does that work in Massachusetts? When will we, because the primary's not until September, as in Rhode Island.
Right. So the convention, everyone just needs to get 15% of the delegate support in order to make the ballot. Everyone that I've spoken to says that all three candidates will make the ballot. It's the primary then on September 4th that will then ultimately determine who is the party's nominee to take on Charlie Baker in November.
It's after a long weekend. So
yes.
That complicates
Day after Labor
things.
Day, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's going to be a tough one. August is probably going to be a little busier than normal in Massachusetts, at least among the political class.
Yeah, the holiday weekend is going to be a working one for those of us.
Again, how is it that Charlie Baker has been able to position himself successfully, particularly with Democrats? Why has he had success there?
Well, I think a lot of it is Democrats in Massachusetts like electing Republican governors. You had William Weld, you've had Paul Cellucci. Deval Patrick was more of a anomaly at this point, although that could change. We'll see. But I think also he hires Democrats. Republicans make up about 11% of the electorate in Massachusetts, so that means he has to go to Democrats. He has to hire them, former mayors, former city managers. The other part is he comes across as pretty likable. He ran in 2010 against Deval Patrick, lost, and learned quite a bit from that race about communication, about reaching out to people, being more open. And I think now he's been very good at distancing himself from the National Republican Party, from Donald Trump, He kind of honed that in the 2014 race, and he's gotten only better at it as his reelection has approached.
Will Richmond from Fall River Herald News, usually the South Coast, not a friendly place for Republicans to be. How is he viewed in your area?
Well, I think he's done a good job of connecting, especially his administration, with elected officials. They've done a good job of building bridges with mayors in the cities, some of the state senators, state representatives. So this helps to trickle down, especially you see a lot of them as the caucuses were held. They're making their appearances at the caucuses, and they're not exactly pumping up the Democratic candidates for governor as well. So, I think in the towns, if you go back to the last election, Baker did fairly well. The cities, Fall River, New Bedford, less so, but those have traditionally been the Democratic strongholds that you talk about. But even comparatively, Baker did better than some of the past Republican candidates have in the past. And even if any of the effect from the presidential election carries over, Republicans, Donald Trump did well in the towns around the South Coast and did better in the cities than expected as well. So there could be some of that sentiment that carries over into the election as well.
Ted, Governor Raimondo can't ignore Baker's popularity to the north. He's a Republican, she's a Democrat, but they seem to have forged a pretty good relationship.
Yeah, they've, in fact, to the point that it might be causing a little trouble. Because Lauren and I were talking before we came on. Don't forget, Charlie Baker donated to Gina Raimondo's election campaign in 2013, despite being about to be the Republican candidate for a second time in Massachusetts. So they're pretty simpatico. They both have business backgrounds. They both see themselves as kind of technocratic problem solver types, despite being in two different political parties, having different bases. They certainly are in touch fairly frequently. They just seem to have a personal rapport and get along well. But it's interesting because Governor Raimondo has now taken on a partisan role as number 2, the vice chair of the Democratic Governors Association, which you'd expect to lead the charge against Charlie Baker in the fall. But she gave our friend Josh Miller a quote at the NGA a couple weeks back saying, basically downplaying the possibility of the Democrats, I think Charlie Baker's doing a good job, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's where her sort of cross-border friendship with him and sort of think, and she also, I think, genuinely believes the Massachusetts and Rhode Island governors need to have a good working relationship because so much of economic development and transportation issues and such are related. But on the other hand, if you're a Democrat, I assume, Lauren, and you see a quote from the Democratic Governor Station number 2 not even pumping up the chances, they could have been too happy about that.
Yeah, exactly. There was some significant pushback by some of the Democratic candidates for governor. I mean, they're essentially not getting love internally by senior Democrats in Massachusetts, and now they're kind of being left holding the bag in terms of national Democrats here. So it's tough for these candidates who, again, don't have name recognition, aren't getting ammo outside of the state, and clearly, if you have the Rhode Island governor hedging with the current Republican governor of Massachusetts in maintaining a good relationship, that I think that kind of says where she expects things to go this November.
Dan, I want to ask you about a possible storm on the horizon for Charlie Baker right now, and that is the scandal surrounding the Massachusetts State Police right now. And in a nutshell, there's about 24 troopers where there are questions about whether or not they worked the massive amount of overtime that they put in for. And just so we understand, and we're talking, in some cases, $230,000 a year just in overtime, so that would put their salary up above $300,000. Now Maura Healey is questioning the transparency of the state police and pressuring Charlie Baker to apply pressure on the state police to be more transparent. How big a headache is this for Charlie Baker right now?
I think he's been very good at kind of trying to stay away from a lot of the scandals that have come up in his administration. I think this one is particularly dangerous because it's such a clear issue of public trust. And it's not just the scandal with the overtime, it's also with the scrubbed arrest report of a judge's daughter. Yeah. And there's also like mini scandals that have been coming up. One trooper who was posting racist things on a message
Feels
board.
a little like a drip, drip, drip of state police stories out of Mass.
It does, and it's I think Maura Healey, to a large degree, when she lashed out at
we should say the Attorney
Baker.
General.
Thank you. The Attorney General, when she lashed out at Baker, it was through an open-ended question, actually. Like, we asked her, like, well, what do you think? What's going on with the state police? And she said, well, Charlie Baker has to get a handle on this.
What does that say?
Right. It's pretty. I think it's pretty interesting that she's investigating some of this stuff. They handed off some of this stuff to her, but she's also saying, like, we have a cultural problem at the state police, and Charlie Baker should take more of a leadership role in cleaning that up. And I think he would say that, you know, I've tapped a new police colonel. You know, we are making some headway, and there's still a long way to go.
I also want to note how rare it is to see infighting between Maura Healey and Charlie Baker. Maura Healey is our Democratic Attorney General. Governor Charlie Baker obviously is a Republican. We don't see a lot of conflict between the top officials in Massachusetts. Even though it seems such a Democratic state with a Republican governor, you don't see partisan fighting. So to see that comment really stuck out to me, and I don't know if that's a function of, you know, Maura Healey feeling the pressure and pushing back, or if this is us getting closer to election day and everyone's kind of falling in line partisan wise. There's a number of different things, but in terms of the state police scandal and this drip, that's something that especially Charlie Baker's Democratic challengers, they're watching because they're also using it as a wedge.
But was there some expectation that Maura Healey was going to be the Democratic challenger to Baker at any point, that she was going to make a run for governor?
There was hope by Democrats and there was concern by Republicans, and you know, the unenrolled voters were kind of interested. About a year ago, basically, when the field was forming, Maura Healey was seen as really the most viable challenger to Charlie Baker. She's a relative newcomer to politics. She shocked everyone by becoming Attorney General back in 2014, winning the Democratic nomination, and has absolutely impressed people and impressed the state party. She has this very magnetic personality that a lot of people really identify with. She has this incredible story. She's LGBT. She is a former pro basketball player, and is, you know, this top litigator. And so she really fits this persona. And she's really, I think, come into her own in the Trump era.
Oh, feels like she sues Trump every few days.
Exactly. I actually did an interview with her this fall and asked her, you know, Madam Attorney General, how many lawsuits against Donald Trump do you have? And she actually didn't know off the top of her head. So you know, she's very much raising her profile, and I think for people in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and around the country, you're going to hear the name Maura Healey a lot more frequently in the future.
She's a lot different too than other attorneys general. I think we've seen with Martha Coakley, Tom Riley. They've struggled to run statewide. They've struggled to break out of that kind of prosecutor mode. She doesn't have a problem with that. It seems like people connect with her. She connects with them. When I was at the St. Patrick's Day breakfast roast in Boston a couple weeks ago, she was one of the last people to leave that hall because she kept shaking hands, taking selfies with people, posing for pictures. She knows how to work the room.
You know, going back to Baker for a second, you know, even as we're talking about a Democratic up-and-comer, one thing that in both Rhode Island and Massachusetts you always have to keep an eye on is how much do these Republicans build their party, which are historically weak in both states, and how much are they a singular force that doesn't have a lot of coattails? And I noted down in our neck of the woods and Wills, you've seen 2 elections recently where Charlie Baker came down. He came down for Attleboro Mayor Kevin Dumas, who, longtime incumbent, he lost to Democratic State Representative Paul Heroux, and Paul Feeney, who was a Bernie Sanders guy, won the Democratic Special State Senate race for Jim Timilty's old seat last year. Again, even though I believe Charlie Baker was behind the Republican in that, and there were some resources there. So, you know, to what extent is he able to kind of use his very high poll numbers to bring along and strengthen the Republican Party, and how much is it just for Charlie Baker?
I mean, I think gubernatorial coattails tend to be overrated. I think we saw that with ballot questions, legalization of marijuana, expanding charter schools. Charlie Baker was on the wrong side of both of those. Voters went the other way. He campaigned pretty heavily for both those ballot questions, and basically what voters said was, you know, that's nice that you think that, but we're going to vote the other way.
Well, before we go to break, and actually we're overdue for it, but what about the broken promises of every governor that seems to come through, and that is the South Coast Rail? Is there bitterness down there with the Baker administration or the Deval Patrick administration? You could keep going back about that.
Well, I think they got off the Mayflower and promised South Coast Rail.
I think right now there is actually hope for South Coast Rail. Once again, you know, it ebbs and flows with every promise.
Fool.
Yeah. You know, the idea of this new route that's going to run through Middleborough instead of Stoughton has garnered a lot of support amongst advocates for the project because of the feeling that it will get done quicker, it will cost less, and they can look at the Stoughton route, which would be much faster in the future. So he's built up support for that. He's worked with local mayors and state reps to kind of get their support behind it as well. Everyone has come to that support with the exception of the Taunton area because essentially they're losing a downtown station.
But Will, I mean, how many governors now have told you guys?
Yes, well, we go back to Bill Weld and the promise to sue him if rail is not built. So, promises come. Promises come, promises go. Rail is still nowhere to be seen, and it's not really much closer than it was any time before.
We'll save this tape and have you back in 5 years. We're going to take a break here on Newsmakers. Our conversation about Massachusetts politics continues. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. This week on Newsmakers, a political roundtable focusing on Massachusetts politics. To my right, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and Lauren Dezensky from Politico Massachusetts. We have Gin Dunchis from Mass Live and Will Richmond from the Fall River Herald News. I want to shift the conversation to Senator Elizabeth Warren. She is up for re-election. She also had fairly strong poll numbers, not Baker strong, but she was up there. But she is her challenger, who is, correct me if I'm wrong, State Rep Jeff Deal. Did I pronounce the name right?
Yeah, one of three challengers, yeah.
Okay. Well, I bring up Deal because he's getting help from a Rhode Island native coming up, right? And it's someone who is a national
and
name.
Former Newsmakers guest, Sean
Spicer.
Yes,
Sean Spicer has been on the show. What's Sean Spicer's role in this campaign for Deal?
So Jeff Deal, it's interesting because with Senator Elizabeth Warren's national profile as kind of this vanguard of the Democratic Party, the Republicans running against her are kind of seizing on the Trumpian aspects of the redness, essentially. And Jeff Deal is trying to essentially say that he has the closest connection to the Trump administration, in part by having Sean Spicer come and fundraise for him in Boston. They're going to the Union Oyster House, a mainstay of Boston, if you will.
Bipartisan too, Barack Obama swung through there.
So it's feeling the political love. But it's interesting seeing these Republican challengers to Elizabeth Warren have to court the Republican base in Massachusetts, of which, as Gin said earlier, it's only 11% of the voters, but they have to win the nomination from those voters and then swing to the middle. So how they do that is going to be really interesting. And honestly, if Elizabeth Warren really wants to make hay out of it, messaging that, Jeff Deal, if he does win the nomination in September, that he had Sean Spicer come to Massachusetts, I'm not sure how popular that's going to be with the general electorate in Massachusetts come November.
Good short-term fundraising, bad long-term optics, possibly.
One would say.
So let me ask this question. Nationally, one of the things that comes up with Elizabeth Warren are the questions about her Native American heritage. She just got that question on a national show on Meet the Press. She getting pressure from a newspaper in Western Massachusetts to take a DNA test. And of course, the president famously refers to her as Pocahontas. So nationally, it gets some traction. And that's probably what some people think of out of Massachusetts when someone says Elizabeth Warren. Is it a big deal in Massachusetts?
I think it got handled in the election when she ran against Scott Brown. I think it got litigated there. I think among the people who dislike her and hate her, yeah, they're going to bring that up. But for most of Massachusetts, they kind of accept her and her explanations, even as those explanations can fall short. A lot of Democratic voters accept them.
But what if she runs for president in 2020?
Well, I think that opens up a whole new can of worms. I mean, you've got a national press corps, you've got more people digging through that stuff. As we've talked about, her answers haven't been that great on that. And I think a lot of it comes from that controversy first reared its head when she was very early in the candidate process. She was still learning how to be a candidate at that point, and a lot of those not great answers were formed in that period.
So another name that comes up for a possible presidential candidate out of Massachusetts is Congressman Joe Kennedy. Is that going to happen?
I don't think so. No, I mean it's. I think the one thing he's expressed interest in is in Senator Warren's Senate seat if she goes and moves on to something else, whether it's the White House or something different.
How's he doing? I mean, he's in your area.
Well, he's immensely popular in southeastern Massachusetts, his district. Strongly in support of him. I'm pretty sure he, at least in the greater Fall River area, within his district, swept all of those communities. I think he sees that he has a lot of value to the party as a whole as well. He's done a lot of campaigning for candidates outside of Massachusetts. He was in Texas just earlier this week. And
does he have a challenger even yet, Will? Because he was unopposed last time.
He has an announced Democratic challenger who is running on a strong climate change platform. Not well known. One of the things about his district as well is it's the stretch of the distance between the suburbs outside of Boston and the communities around Fall River. Makes these sort of lesser known candidates that you don't see a lot of them if they're from the north end of the district down here in the Fall River area. So, at this point, it's kind of cruise control, it would seem.
Kennedy's been fascinating to watch because he, as the congressman for the Massachusetts part of our area, they were very, very focused on downplaying the Kennedy mystique, the celebrity aspect of his run when he ran in 12 and in his first term. And I don't know if you'd agree, Will, but I feel like I've seen a shift in the last year, even before that, but especially in the last year, where he is much more willing to use his family name and the attention that can bring and the legacy that carries with it, as well as, as you just said, he was in Texas. He's been all over fundraising. They had him do the State of the Union response, which went all right despite the chapstick. It seems like Kennedy's starting to feel more comfortable with all that comes with being Joe Kennedy, especially since he's very secure in his district.
Yeah, I think he sees that he doesn't have to lean on the name to have success, but certainly it's a part of him. He's not going to get away from it. He's talked a lot more with the RFK anniversary coming up this year.
Who is his grandfather?
His grandfather. So, he's been a part of that discussion in a lot of different forums, and I would expect that to continue as well, especially if he doesn't have a serious election coming up. That's going to be something that will give him, he'll have more time to kind of spend on that than really worry about campaigning on any issues or anything in this district.
Lauren, I was reading a while back that there might be some ego, bumping between Congressman Seth Moulton and Congressman Joe Kennedy. Is there truth to that, or do you believe what Joe and Seth say? We're best buddies and we work out at the gym together all the time.
I mean, that's a fun parlor game, right? Is Massachusetts big enough for Joe Kennedy and Seth Moulton, the egos associated with them? But honestly, from all of the conversations that I've had about this, because I've been super interested in this as well, there's not necessarily conflict. They clearly want they're both clearly ambitious, but they're ambitious in different ways. And I'm not convinced that their ambitions force them to overlap. Joe Kennedy is working within the established Democratic power structure. He is involved in the DCCC. He's a Nancy Pelosi supporter. When he travels the country, he's supporting candidates that he has established relationships with, like in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, I think was one of his roommates or something. Like he has a really deep connection with the people that he does decide to work with. Whereas Seth Moulton started a PAC, is supporting 19 different candidates around the country, is fundraising in California.
Does not support Pelosi as minority leader.
Exactly. That's like the most crucial difference. So the two of them are just doing two completely different things. But of course, it's Massachusetts. We have a lot of people who want to run for president, and so it's natural. Exactly. So it's natural to look at that ambition and to kind of see it intersecting. But honestly, I don't see the two of them necessarily crossing.
It seems like they have two different styles too. Moulton, and I don't cover the Seth Moulton as a journalist, but it seems like he's more of a flamethrower kind of guy, where Joe Kennedy is a little bit more measured. Is that an accurate assessment of their two styles?
Yeah,
Moulton fires from the hip a lot more. I mean, he's taken shots at Governor Baker, and he's also worked with Governor Baker on stuff. I think, Joe Kennedy tends to be much more quiet. I think even anybody who's been in a scrum with him too, it's his voice drops, and it's like you have to lean in with the microphone a little bit more.
We struggle to get a juicy quote when he's on.
Yes, exactly. We have 1 minute left. I wanted to touch briefly on the scandal between Brian Hefner, the estranged husband of former Senate President Stanley Rosenberg. Real quick, Rosenberg, this has already had a political impact. In 30 seconds, is he facing a challenger right now?
Yes, so Stan Rosenberg is still in the Senate. He's running for re-election. He now has a Democratic primary challenger out in Western Massachusetts. The woman, I believe, is a first-time candidate. We're seeing a lot of waves of different Democratic challengers in the state. But there's a lot of tumult in the state Senate right now, and the indictments that were just handed out against Brian Hefner is not helping the sense of peace in the state house right now.
Lauren Dezensky from Politico, Massachusetts, Gim Doomchis from Mass Live, and Will Richmond from the Fall River Herald News. Thank you very much. And most of you are watching this on a Sunday, as you can tell from Ted Nesi's tie. It is spring. Happy Easter to all of you watching this at home. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.